And we're on recording. So welcome today to this final session on telehealth and rehabilitation and offered to you by the University of Otago. I'm Fee Graham and I teach interprofessional postgraduate rehabilitation here in New Zealand. This session we're thinking about, in particular, about measurement. Now, we are now sitting in a group of emerging experts on telehealth delivery. So I wanted to allow plenty of space in this particular session for you to share ideas and talk about the way that you've been doing it at your place. We all come from very, very different types of clinical situations as well. So I've kept the concepts pretty broad so that, but offering some points of view for thinking about measurement in a tele-delivery context. It might help to provide some assurance at the types of challenges that you're facing and to sort of give some frameworks for the way you think about solving some of the problems that you're facing. But I also want you to very much keep on sharing the ideas that you have developed in the chat box, because there's far, far more knowledge in this group than there is among any one person at this point. So the main things we're thinking about today are what we are measuring and why, and how we measure and how we can do this reliably over a telehealth context. So how we measure. We have let's think about it in terms of three main options in measurement. I am particularly thinking of the allied health post-acute measurement in healthcare delivery context in this presentation as well. So that's the scope of the focus. So three main ways that we measure are patient report. We ask a question and the client answers it. If you could just pop yourself on mute if you're not currently talking, that would be really helpful with background noise. So patient report, asking a question and having the client describe their circumstances. Now we might do that just broadly speaking in an interview, how have things been for you, how are things going, or we might do it in terms of one of the formal and standardized assessment. So those standardized assessments, they've been through rigorous analysis of how that assessment functions, how the wording of those items work, and how the scoring relate from one item to the other and how stable those scores are over time. That's called analysis of the psychometrics of the measure. So that's quite those two types of categories. There's some common ones up there, but that many of you will know, but think about just those ones that you usually often have to purchase them. Sometimes they're available freely online, such as the DAS-21, a measurement of depression, anxiety and stress, essentially a large amount of development has gone into those measures. But when it comes down to how do we actually execute them, we do that by asking a question. So it's a verbal exchange, and that's something that's pretty straightforward to do over a telehealth delivery situation. And we wouldn't normally expect that conducting that type of questionnaire over a tele-delivery would change the way somebody responds to the items. So we could be reasonably assured that the reliability of that measure is pretty consistent in a telehealth context as opposed to an in-person context when we're both there together in the same room. You possibly already did some of that type of measurement over the phone or with video conferencing pre-COVID. That would feel familiar. The second way we measure is through observational measures. And this refers to all the types of measures where we observe somebody doing a task and interpret the way we observe they having done it. Now, I did say the word task, and when I mean that, it might mean balancing on one foot on a beam, or it might be making eggs at home in their kitchen. Either way, as the therapist, our tool is our ability to observe the person doing it. And in the way that we report that or score that or analyze it might be through a formal assessment tool, such as the GMFM or the PRPP, the SAROM measure, or the AMPS, different ways of rating, even gait analysis. We might do that through observation of the person doing, we do that through observation essentially. Now, the observational measures that have been available to us for us until now, we could separate into, leaving aside the blood tests and scanning at the moment, those measures are divided into ones that are standardized for occurring in a really standardized environment, such as a clinic where we have, you know, particular distances marked out on the lino and the chart on the wall behind in the room that we are you know, scoring, say, body position or movement against. So that's where the reliability of that observational measure is dependent on us having really strict testing conditions in place. The other type of measure is ones in which they are suitable to a naturalistic environment where the person can be in their home environment, and we observe them doing the task. And say the PRPP might be an example of this type of observational tool. There is a range of guidance within that measure, but it can be used for a task being done under any conditions. So they might be doing it in their home kitchen, they might have noisy children coming and going in the background. There might be really unideal physical arrangements of the environment, but you could still do that kind of measure. So our challenge, obviously, within the telehealth environment is that we really only have that naturalistic environment way of doing observational measures currently while the social distancing policies are in place. The thing to be aware of here as the health professional is, what are we doing with the scores of observational measures that require highly controlled conditions? We might still find for example, some of the items in the movement ABC or Brunick's Obrowski's assessments of measurement, we might find some of those types of activities it's still useful to know in understanding what's going on with a child. But in terms of scoring and presenting a standardized evaluation of those results, that becomes invalid when we're doing it in a non-standardized environment for those measures. This leads us on to the next slide, where we're thinking about why we are measuring. So just thinking about that difference between a standardized assessment and standardized scoring, and how that informs our interpretation of what's happening with the child, versus non-standardized assessments, or a non-standardized use of an assessment that was designed to be done in a highly standardized way. Any comments or questions there? Are we with me? We're with me? Laurie's with me. I'll go with that, Laurie. Yep. Joanna, thanks very much. That's all I need. And so the other type of observational measures that will be relevant for some of us and some of our work is things like blood tests, imaging, strength training, and maybe even formal gait analysis. And I guess to varying degrees, these in emergency situations, these kinds of things are available to us currently. So those kind of, just flagging them up there, really at this point, they would fit into that same kind of category of tests. And then finally, another way of thinking about the type of measures that we use are those ones that absolutely depend on a hands-on assessment. And here we're thinking about the Tardieu scale and as assessments of, you know, things like tone, swelling, nodules, etc., where we really need to absolutely feel what's going on. And so unless it's an absolute emergency situation or avoiding a hospital admission, certainly in New Zealand, we're basically not doing that sort of thing at the moment. So that's a red stop, not an option currently for most of us. So the challenge is, well, what is the key information I needed to know that I normally would have done that type of measure for? And how else can could I find out that kind of information? And at this point, I'm very much telling grandmas to suck eggs here with this, because you already have gone through this problem solving process, I know. I just wanted to flag to you before we go too much further on too, we have our guest the IT guy you always wanted, Jeff or Mindy, dropping in about 3/4 of the way through today's session, and he's there to answer your tech questions. So some people emailed those through to me this week. If you didn't get around to doing that, don't pop them in the chat box, because you could pop them in the chat box if you like. Mindy will keep a track of those. Please, Mindy. Or just say them out loud when Jeff pops in a little while. So keeping those things in mind. Now we're actually taking a step back now and thinking about, well, why do we measure? So my idea here is to prompt you to think about, well, if I'm a bit clearer about my rationale about why I'm measuring, this might open up some of my creative thinking around how I can gain that kind of information. Now, essentially, this is one perspective anyway, the various reasons why we measure can be broken down into these three reasons. We measure in order to gatekeep access to services, many of us. Are they severe enough to be eligible for funding for teacher aid time, for funding of a particular piece of equipment, for entry into the system? So that's one purpose. Sometimes we're assessing to better understand the mechanism of what is happening for the client. Another side of that is, and the intention there is to be able to identify solutions to the client's problems. So understanding the mechanisms in the system, how they're working together in an individual system, can be useful in helping us to arrive at solutions that make the client's life better and help the client to better understand what their choices are. And finally, we use assessment to evaluate outcomes. How successful was this intervention with this client? Can I prove to my funder or to my service manager that we are doing best practice, that what we're doing here is working really well, that this service is worth getting that contract again? Now, if we think about the reasons why we measure, it enables us to break down what the different options are about the way that we go about doing those measurements. So in terms of access to gatekeeping access to services, this is where we may find ourselves wanting to do assessments or needing to do assessments that may or may not align with our with some of these other purposes here, right? But it's a particular role that many of us fill. And the type of assessment we need to do depends on how the system that we're working in has organised their gatekeeping. So often, unfortunately, I would say, often it's around level of impairment. Maybe sometimes it needs to be like that. So access will depend on whether the person is severe enough in the disorder or the disturbance in their body structures and functions. So one assessment that looks at the level of impairment would be the VMI, the visual motor integration tool. So that's a kind of tool that can be done. It's an observational measure. So when we're looking at level of impairment, we can ask these things descriptively. Pain scales is a good example of that. Now, pain scales are usually asked simply by asking the person, normally operate on the basis of asking the person, how bad is it, using various types of numerical or picture or analog scales. So we're drawing there, we can draw there on a self-report measure, or it might be an observational measure, such as draw these pictures and then I'll look at that and analyze what your visual motor function is at. Again, we can offer that in a tally-based way. So something like the VMI, where you ask a child to draw a series of pictures, it is a standardized assessment. And so when we're making that call about how severe this person is, we've got to be very careful when we do this in a non-standardized way, i.e. over telehealth. We've asked the parent perhaps to set up the environment, and we have asked them to guide the child through doing these tasks, and we might even guide the child ourselves through telehealth, but things like the parent correcting the child and telling them how to do it and giving them 3 goes at it when the test only specifies that they have 1. These are the kind of situations that will negate the scoring of severity of impairment. If we're using that as a gatekeeper situation, then this is something we need to think extremely carefully about, because the scoring is no longer valid under these conditions. Now, you'll need to make a clinical judgment, and these are obviously trying times, around the way that that sort of individual conducted that test in the natural environment. Did it disrupt the way that this test is supposed to be done? Was it significantly different, or was it pretty much how it would have rolled out in the clinic anyway? And that's a call that only that you can make. So another type of assessment that we use is to gatekeep access is the level of need. And so the INTI is an example of that, used in the elder population here in New Zealand. Where the level of need in the NDIS system in Australia is also more based on this kind of gatekeeping process. It's level of need rather than severity of impairment is the dividing line between receiving access to therapies or not, and support. Again, it's an interview with someone. It's a self-report measure of, can you do this task, can you do that task, how much help do you need with that. That aligns very clearly with a telehealth delivery format. That exchange of information, you wouldn't expect it to be different via telehealth. So another, when we're trying to understand the mechanisms of what's going on in somebody's system in order to inform our therapy, we're often interested in the nature of impairments. And so now this is an example. You might use observational measures to see the way a person performs a task. Well, show me what it looks like when you attempt to get up and down off the floor or in and out of the chair. Or this might be where you ask the child to go through a range of non-functional positions, but positions that, based on your knowledge of the developing neurological system, that you can see particular things, asymmetries, functional use of tone and so on, in the way that the child goes about moving in between those positions and the way that they go about the tasks. So here we come to the situation where it's not the standardized score that's necessarily informing our practice, but we're looking at the way a person does the tasks, and maybe even the interaction between the different systems, where we might look at ways of assessing the child's or the person's attention span, their planning skills, and their motor skills. And we put that together to kind of create a clinical picture for ourselves to understand the mechanisms that are going on. This is where we can be really creative. We're not restricted to any standardized protocols in the assessments, because we're not using it to compare this person to the rest of the population, the way that we are in our gatekeeping roles. So we can do whatever we think would be useful in order to see what information that's going to support us to be able to help this client to problem solve. I'm fascinated to hear some of the creative ways that people have done this. One of the big challenges is getting a good camera shot of this sort of thing. And I'd love to hear some of the things that you've done in order to problem solve that with people in their home. So you can pop those into the chat box too as we continue along. And the other kinds of information that might come into that picture is around complexity of context, or also personal factors and personal points of view. Again, that's drawing on your general interview skills. Again, that's fitting really easily with a telehealth environment, because it's a series of questions that we're asking. Part of that interviewing as well is also thinking about what is it that you know works. to their client? What is it that you've already found that helps you to be able to manage the situation? So asking those kinds of coaching questions is essentially an extension on your interviewing skills. And some have argued that when we interview for solutions, we need to know much less detail about the nature of impairments than we used to. This comes back to that concept I mentioned in the first couple of weeks around communication with the client as the lead partner in the communication. They're the ones that have the authority to say what is a problem and where the solutions lie for them, rather than us taking on that role as the health professional, which we traditionally have. Now, in terms of evaluating outcomes, and I've had a lot of email and inquiries around this sort of thing as people are trying very hard to be accountable for the way that they're using their therapy time in this telehealth environment, and preempting those questions from funders and managers down the line. Did we do anything useful during COVID? Now, I know for a fact that you absolutely did, and through the way that you've supported your clients, but how can we evaluate this? So this is kind of goes beyond telehealth. These are good questions to ask at any time, but obviously suddenly switching a delivery format is a really good time to double check those kinds of things. So the two main ways that we do this: evaluate the outcomes of the service or the outcomes for an individual client, are a reduction in need. And so that's going back to our the types of assessments that we used at the level of in the level of need conversation. It's the same kinds of things. So key kinds of variables that we'd be looking for there is a reduction in medication use, to manage sleep, or inattention, might be reduction in support hours, might be home care support hours to support people through daily routines, might be school-based level of support needed to keep a child in the classroom succeeding really well in the classroom. I've put there in brackets, reduce need, reduce costs, because really that's what most of our funders are interested in. Overall, our input has related to a lower level of cost for the outside of the fee-for-service private practice environment. That's a really big marker for any publicly funded support, is that overall this person has a lower level of cost associated with them, or at least not increasing cost. Any comments or questions there? I'm sure there's probably people that are very much in those kinds of roles among us today that might like to throw in their thoughts. Mindy, I'll just leave it to you to alert me to anything in the chat box and interrupt me, because I can't monitor that at the same time.
Sure. There's been just some people sharing a couple of ideas and stuff that they're using as they go along.
Oh, cool. Oh, well, I'll be sure to look through those later and stow them into my own little tele tool bag as well. And so when we're looking at reduced cost, the kinds of things that assessment, if you like, or information exchange is kind of just gathering literally data and numerical data, or descriptive information perhaps from the client. So again, we're back to those green client report, or perhaps in this case, health service, or teacher, or system reports around the level of cost involved, literally counting the costs. That can equally be done via tele as it can be via in person. And finally, absolutely not least, is patient-reported outcomes. And this is close to the heart of every health professional I know, that we make a difference in people's lives, and particularly from the perspective that the client perceives that their lives are better, not that it just says that they're better on some standardized assessment. This is the ultimate outcome and intention of any rehabilitation or healthcare intervention. And it's the ultimate outcome for funders as well. Yes, costs are absolutely a factor, but that it was perceived as meaningful by the recipients of care is a common language between the policy developers, the contract developers, and the funders and the deliverers of the service yourself, and of course the client. And so the concepts of participation in life situations, as described in the International Classification of Functioning, all these things are really easy to look up online if you want to go further with them, but that description that the person in the context of their lives is more satisfied, is able to engage in the things that they value. Now, I use the problematic word satisfaction in there just as a general kind of term, but just asking somebody, are you satisfied with the service you receive? The classic patient satisfaction survey at the intimate a couple of times a year is a very poor metric for evaluating outcomes, because 99% of people that will respond to those will tell you it was great. Not only do you have no specific information about how to improve your already awesome service to be an awesome service, you're not going to hear the voice of the people that it didn't work well for on those, unless they're except for the 1 or 2% on the extreme who have been waiting for this opportunity to rant about how terrible your service was and that nothing went right in it, which will also be unlikely to be true. So the types of measures there are a lot of really good outcome measures available for capturing quite specific and psychometrically robust metrics or measures of how satisfied a person was with services, but particularly how satisfied are they with their life now in the specific context that you're working with them. How satisfied are they now compared to how they were previously? And one of the common features of these types of measures, I've popped up the COPM and the GAS there, and these are the two measures that are most frequently used internationally and interprofessionally, and that means you've got one metric across the team in many of our rehabilitation service, which is a huge advantage in quality assurance and improvement of care. A key feature of that is that they don't just ask generally how satisfied were you, because that's the problem with those satisfaction measures, is the question is so general that it's very difficult to interpret the score that the person came back with. What these COPM and GAS type measures is, they create an individualized statement that relates to that particular person about one specific aspect of the way they go about their life and how it is for them now. And there's different types of ways that you can rate that, but essentially the question is quite specific. And so they're commenting on how well they perceive they can currently do it now versus previously, and how satisfied that they are with those kinds of things. So being quite specific. And you will need to think about what the copyright is around the use of some of those measures, and the COPM and the GAS, for example, vary quite differently in the copyright permissions for using those kinds of measures. In many of these things too, we could create an online survey of them where we we put the questions into some sort of online data collection. So like, I'm thinking SurveyMonkey, that sort of thing that many of you will be familiar with. SurveyMonkey, however, now has become quite restrictive unless you pay for it, and there are many other options like that as well. We do need to think about the layout of some of those tools. If we do convert them to an online format, sometimes it'll change the psychometric reliability of the measure, because the layout can be significant in the way that people answer the questions, especially some of the ones with quite complicated graphic layouts. So I'm going to just pose some questions to you now, and then you might like to note those down. I don't think I can copy and paste them, it'll change the slide. You might like to just note those down, or something to that effect, about rethinking some of your assumptions about measurement, and what are some of those assumptions that we've had that either the talk so far has challenged, or that you've noticed that you have gone through a reflexive process yourself over the last few weeks that has been challenged. How much detail do we really need to be useful? historically, health professions have been somewhat obsessed with gathering detailed information. It comes from our history under the medical model and medical systems, but I'll throw it out there for us to rethink that. Do we really need as much specific detail, particularly about impairments, in order to solve the problem or support the client to solve their own problem? What else could this client possibly get involved with in this work together? So when we are doing some kind of assessment, could they hold the iPad? Could they direct the child's movement or the person's movement? Could they ask you what they feel or notice? We've talked before about client engagement and how critical that is under any health delivery situation, but could we think about how can we enhance client engagement even in the assessment process? That's a critical kind of thing in terms of self-management of any health condition. You're only going to have you for a little while. So this is one way or another, this is something they're going to be doing on their own. The earlier we can bring this in to our work together, the sooner that they are autonomous and involved in their managing their own health. And I threw this out there on the first week, and I just thought I'll pop it in there again in relation to assessment and measurement. Letting go of authority doesn't necessarily make us less professional. Authority, control over how the process, over what we're doing with the client. And it often actually, in fact, makes us more useful. So with those thought-provoking statements, I'm now going to drop you out into breakout rooms. Don't jump away, because if you feel like this is now going to make you do, I just noticed a couple of people popped out there as I said that. What I want you to do now, you're going to drop in, this is your opportunity. This is also the last breakout opportunity that you're going to have. So if you want to have a discussion about how you're going to keep connected longer term, now's your opportunity to do that as well. So about 5 minutes for this discussion, and then we'll come back together for a close. So you've got an invite. If you accept the invite now, you'll pop into those breakout rooms, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Hi Jeff, so we're going to be 5 minutes at this point. Jeff, you might have heard that. I hope that's going to be okay for you. Are you going to be able to come back, or you can just park yourself there if you like?
Yeah, happy to.
Awesome. Oh yeah. Carry on,
Jeff. Happy to stay here, Fee. I'll just jump in when you.
Recording restarted. I just want you to pop some of your highlights from that discussion for you in the chat box currently. Now we have a oh, I haven't shared my screen, so you can't see, can you? Oh no, I don't want to share screen. Can everyone see Mindy's screen? Catriona, can you see Mindy's screen? Okay, so I'd like to introduce Mindy Silver, who I have mentioned on almost every one of these video conference sessions because Mindy's doing her PhD on the use of technology in rehabilitation. So Mindy has this suggestion for an activity for thinking about assessment that involves you getting ready with your mouse. Mindy, would you like to explain the task?
Sure. So if you look down to your screen where you've got the place where you normally mute or unmute, if you run across it, you'll see a little annotate button, a little pencil that says annotate. And if you click on that, then you'll get a second menu that pops up. And in that menu, you'll see something, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's about the 5th one along. It says stamp. And if you click on that, it allows you to select different images, an arrow or a tick or a cross or a star or a heart or a question mark. And so what we're going to do, if you could click on that, you should be able to annotate the screen. Yep, you're going to click on that and you're going to, oh, everybody's doing it before I've even said anything. Okay, you're going to tick on all the assessment measures that you think might be useful or doable online. So, yeah, so hang on, I'm going to clear everybody's things and we're going to start again. So make sure you've clicked on annotate. So look down at the bottom of your menu.
Mindy, can I interrupt? Because I found Annotate using a different process to what you described. So for me, I clicked on, at the top of my screen, just beside where it says you are viewing Mindy Silver's screen, it says view options. And if I clicked on that, I get a drop down box of options, and one of them is Annotate. And when I click on that, a new bar comes up, and one of the options on that bar is Stamp.
Yeah. Okay, so you're going to click in the circles on all the assessment tests that you think would be usable and doable online, just to get an idea of how much there are. And while you're doing that, I'm not sure.
Just maybe 10 seconds more to have a go.
And then I will save that. I'll give you a countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so I'm going to say that just to kind of give you an idea of everything that's out there that you could be using. And this is just a snapshot of what you can adapt online. And I think it really just boils down eventually to our own creativity. And I'll share the link to this document that's got all these tests with you in the chat box in a second. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and give it back to you, Fee.
One of my co-workers is having them down outside my door, so apologies for the overflow. Mindy, did you want to share another screen, or you're done?
No, I can.
Oh, you're going to put it in the chat box. You're going to put those links in the chat box. And Mindy also runs a community of practice around the use of technology in rehabilitation. So she's going to put the link to some of those conversations in the chat box as well. So thank you, Mindy. Can you see my top tip slide currently? Okay. If you mute yourself, if you're not, mute yourself if you're not speaking, because there's a bit of voiceover coming through. Thank you. Slide here, which looks quite pathetic right at this moment, given the amount of sharing that's been going on. Mindy, if you could mute everyone, please.
I did. I'm just doing it again.
And it looks pathetic, and you have your own fabulous bunch of things to apply to that as well. But as already said today, be prepared. That's a real classic with the telehealth situation. We don't have our usual cues. Think about things that could be useful beforehand or afterwards as follow-ups. Be really clear. Somebody's already shared back the ideas from the WHOI process that we shared in an earlier video conference, and be flexible. The way that we go about that assessment might not be the way we'd like to do it, might not be perfect, might forgo some accuracy, but does it give us the information we need for the purpose that we're using this assessment for at the moment. A couple of things around food for thought too, about future directions and other sort of considerations in assessment online. Do think about security and ethics of information being shared. If the parent's sending you videos of their child, particularly, children in middle childhood and older or adult dependents, do they have that person's consent to do that? We have the possibility of seeing more into people's private spaces than we did previously, and everybody that needs to be consenting to that happening. We might want to create our own versions of things using some of the software, the survey software and things that are available for it to help with filling in of forms, but again, think about changes to layout on that. A lot of places offer, in this patient activation measure here is one of them, a lot of places offer an online version for free or buy the version for a few $100s. So obviously it's pretty tempting to go with the free version. And often what that requires is that we enter the information online into an online system that goes back to that company, and then they provide us a printout of the results of the assessment. So just check the policies and procedures for your organisation around doing that, because it's essentially externally sharing health information. And a key thing in that, of course, will be any identifying information about the patient being shared in that information exchange. It might not be their NHI, the National Health Number, but it might be enough information about them for some of our clients that would make them quite easy to identify. Just got to think, if it was Kate Middleton who was your client, and all the vested interests in finding out all her data metrics, would this be okay? And you never know with some of our clients what their future public life is going to be. There is a lot of activity in the area of the use of wearable sensors, drones, and there are existing on-screen measurement systems available. But I think, for example, for wheelchair assessment and things, they're extremely expensive. So that's something worth thinking about. And again, going back to that, how much information do I need to know to make a therapeutic decision here? Is this something that we really need to wait until we're down to a lower level of social distancing, or is it something that we need to be fully equipped and make happen? Now, without any further ado, I would just like to provide you these thoughts around our ongoing development of communities of practice. Here are some things that we have available, and you're welcome to take those details down. And I'd like to introduce Jeff Ormandy to you now. Jeff's got a couple of questions that were sent through to him over the week from you. Jeff, where are you, Jeff?
I'm here, Fee.
There you are, Jeff.
Hi,
Hi.
everyone. Perhaps I should introduce myself. I'm the team leader for e-conferencing here at University of Otago. So our team supports primarily Zoom, but other video conferencing platforms and audio conferencing platforms as well. But mainly Zoom is what we support.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's mainly been Zoom that people have been using. If there are other technologies that you've been using, you can pop those into the chat box as well. As Jeff said, he is familiar with quite a few of them. So, Jeff, we've had a couple of questions over the series of workshops on technology, and I've done my best to answer some of those. So Erska's interested in the privacy and confidentiality of Zoom, and is there a difference with the free version? She also mentions Microsoft Teams. Is there differences with the free versus the paid versions of these softwares?
Yeah, thanks, Fee. Yeah, there's probably been a wee bit of media around the security of Zoom recently, mainly because the vast majority of the world seems to have jumped on board and started using it, whereas previously it was really just universities and corporates. And I think the reason behind that is Zoom is very user friendly, and people have found it an excellent platform. So they've really stepped up. I think prior to where we are now, there were some concerns that they have addressed now around those, and I think which is probably quite critical to telehealth was around the access to meetings that people might be able to jump in and cause problems or get access to information that they shouldn't. One of those things, I think, the questions around encryption for Zoom meetings. Now, if you do a quick search for that, a Google search, you will find information around that pretty quickly. The main thing being is that from Zoom's perspective anyway, if everybody is using the Zoom app, so they're on their laptop or mobile device using the Zoom app, then those meetings are encrypted. Once you start adding in people on phones or other video conferencing endpoints, then it's more difficult for Zoom to handle that. Now, their definition of encryption sort of does differ a little bit from what some industry standards are. So they're working towards getting that fixed. So I'm not an expert in that field. All I would just say is that as far as our understanding is, and the work that I've done with our info security team is, we are very confident that Zoom is a secure platform, and in fact, probably given the recent updates, one of the most secure platforms out there. One of the updates that did come was a in-meeting security button for hosts, where they can easily access all the in-meeting security features, such as locking the meeting or putting on waiting rooms. And those features, I would say, are incredibly important. And if you're going to be hosting any meetings that would have confidential information, and I would say that is something that you'd really want to get familiar with.
And that was really easy to do, was to put, you called it activate the waiting room facility on the meetings, and so people only come into the meetings once I click admit on the individual person.
And I think that's a fantastic feature, and a little bit tricky if you have a really large audience, but as far as being able to manage who does enter into your meetings, that is a fantastic feature, and certainly gives you a lot of control as a host.
Jeff, we have a couple of questions coming through in terms of comparison of security between the different platforms. Google Meet, Microsoft, well, you talked about Teams already, GenSolve, DoxyMe, Blue Jeans.
There are so many platforms out there. I would say, like, actually, a quick Google search does gives you a lot of good insight. Now, I would just be wary of some of the results that you get there, because you never quite know where they're driven from and who is actually promoting what. But from my perspective, we've done a good look at Zoom, of course, and we're confident with that. Microsoft Teams is another application that we're running on campus. We're also comfortable with that. But in saying that, with Microsoft Teams, we haven't done the full in-depth sort of overview of the security that we have with Zoom. So that is sort of next on the list to really do that deep dive. So I would, I'm reserving some judgment on that. As far as the other ones are concerned, yeah, I'd be cautious. Make sure you do your homework and have a wee look. I wouldn't be able to specifically say any are worse than Zoom, but I wouldn't say there would be many out there that would be better.
Well, that's wisdom from the trenches, Jeff. And I think certainly, and this is not a this is said as an indicative thing, but a lot of my medical consultant colleagues are using Zoom for their telehealth consults as a benchmarking kind of indicator of perceptions of security for healthcare conversations and encounters. And we talked a little bit about the other week, and Jeff, you might want to rephrase this, but we talked a little bit about the main security compromise that we're making when we do use these free platforms, including Skype, is the back of house data mining, data dredging in our computers, and not access to the video recording as if somebody could put that on YouTube. That's where that encryption, I should stop now, but Jeff, if you just wanted to say, in case I've got my technical terms wrong, but
yeah, I think you're on the right track. I think one of the concerns around that was raised around Zoom, at least, was with it being a cloud application, there is the option as a host to be able to, if you're on a paid account at least, record to their cloud servers. Now, you want to be aware of the fact that when you are recording to a cloud server, it could be in the US. So, that's outside of the country, might be outside of the, the parameters of what you should be sticking to. So that would be something that I would be potentially, having a question mark around. One thing that Zoom has done as part of the security update is they've given you a lot more control on paid accounts, at least, of where your traffic goes. You can actually restrict it to certain countries. We can't restrict it just to within New Zealand, because they don't have servers within here, but we could restrict it within to Australia, and I think that would be in line with what a lot of other cloud applications have been permitted to to be acceptable within New Zealand, as far as what I've been told, at least by our info security team. So yeah,
that's something that I hadn't realised until a couple of years ago, that the cloud, I think perhaps it was you that told me, Jeff, that the cloud actually means servers like boxes located of big computers located in specific geographical locations, and most of these large providers have multiple locations in multiple very distinct geographies around the world. So they make multiple copies in these different server locations. The encryption and things is where the security is. It's extremely unlikely someone's physically going to get their hands on a particular server. It's more like a tsunami or an earthquake or something hits one location is the reason that they have the multiple sites.
yeah, and to make sure that they can keep the service up. Yep. That's the the main reason, especially given the massive increase in usage. So yeah, I think there was another query there around screen sharing from iPads. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's quite a specific question
Yep.
from Jane, who's obviously pushing the boat out there with the way that she's using the video conferencing for quite dynamic therapy. And do you want me to read it out? I probably should read it out, shouldn't I? So Jane's been having a challenging situation where she's using an iPad. She's trying to share screens to review a photo, watch a video with the family while they've been online at the same time. And when she tries to do that, Zoom seems to want to upload to the cloud.
Yeah, so with screen sharing on iOS devices, so iPads and iPhones, the process is a little bit different from what you would do in a typical meeting when you're connected from a desktop. And I think it's to do with some of the privacy settings that Apple enforce on those devices. And so when you go to do screen sharing, the process is a lot more involved, especially the first time you've done it. You've got to go through and enable some settings. You've got to allow Zoom to be able to screen record. So that can be quite a barrier for people, especially if you're wanting to do it on the fly with somebody and they haven't had the preparation. So my thoughts around that really are that, if you can do some pre-work with those people, they're going to be using an iOS device to share a document with you, then it probably would be worthwhile giving them a heads up on what they would need to do that. Also, when you are sharing from those devices, I think the prerequisites for being able to share certain applications is different. So if you were just wanting to share photos from one of those devices, I don't think it's quite as involved as having to get them to screen share their entire device. So you could perhaps adopt that as an option. I did find the specific page on that for iOS screen sharing on the Zoom help site, so I might actually just pop that in the chat feed.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and that could be quite useful.
Okay. I think we'll leave it there with the technical questions and draw this fabulous time together to a close. I want to thank you all so much for your participation and for your courage in boldly continuing to serve your clients the best you can in these really challenging circumstances. And I think we have to say goodbye there, team. And sorry, one last thing: the ear tables that we've did I have it on there on the previous slide? They will continue to run. So those of you watching by video, please do jump on there and feel a part of the community and look and see what some of the fabulous other learning other people have done. Go well. Take care and. Random act of kindness for yourself, I think, if you haven't already done that, and maybe someone else. So, ka kite anō.
Thanks, Fee.
Bye, everybody, and thank you, Fee.
And Jeff.